The lawyer's voice cut through the funeral home like a knife through silk, reading my father's will with clinical precision. And to my daughter Elena, I leave the controlling shares of Castellano Industries, the property portfolio including. My mother-in-law's champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. My husband's face drained of color as his brother grabbed the edge of a chair for support. They had thrown me out 3 weeks ago, certain I was a broke disappointment leeching off their precious family name. Now, in a room full of lawyers and witnesses, they were learning exactly what I actually owned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I had known this moment was coming. I had prepared for it with the same quiet precision I had used to survive the past 5 years in their household. What they mistook for weakness had actually been strategy. What they interpreted as dependence had been documentation. What they dismissed as passivity had been patience. The champagne spreading across the floor like liquid gold seemed almost poetic. They had celebrated my departure from their mansion as if removing dead weight. Now they stood frozen, realizing they had discarded the one person who never needed them at all. My father had built an empire from nothing, and he had taught me to do the same without anyone noticing. While my in-laws counted their inherited money and congratulated themselves on their sophisticated tastes, I had been quietly acquiring, investing, and building wealth they never imagined existed. They saw me serving tea in their drawing room and assumed I was grateful for their charity. They never asked what I did during the hours I spent in my father's study, or why lawyers called me by my maiden name, or why my father smiled whenever they condescended to me at family dinners. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in on the people who had once made me feel so small. My sister-in-law, who had suggested I apply for jobs as a shop assistant because everyone needs to contribute, stared at me with an expression I had never seen before. Fear. Recognition. The sudden understanding that she had been cruel to someone who never needed to tolerate it. I met her eyes with the same calm neutrality I had maintained for 5 years, offering nothing. No reassurance. No explanation. Just the steady gaze of someone who had finally stopped pretending. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand how we arrived at this moment, how I came to be standing in a funeral home watching my in-laws realize their catastrophic mistake, you need to understand where this story truly began. Not at the funeral, but 5 years earlier, when I first walked into the Hartwell family mansion as Michael Hartwell's new wife, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and a secret my father had insisted I keep. The Hartwell estate sat on 12 acres of manicured grounds in the most exclusive postal code in the city, a sprawling Tudor Revival mansion that had been in the family for 4 generations. The circular driveway was lined with perfectly pruned hedges, the fountain in the center featuring a bronze sculpture that probably cost more than most people's homes. I had seen wealth before. My father's business associates lived in similar enclaves, displayed similar markers of generational prosperity. But the Hartwells wore their wealth differently. They wielded it like a weapon, a constant reminder of hierarchy and belonging. Michael had been charming during our courtship, attentive in ways that felt genuine rather than performative. We had met at a charity gala, one of dozens my father encouraged me to attend as part of what he called my education in reading people. Michael had approached me near the silent auction tables, making intelligent observations about the art being offered, asking questions that suggested genuine interest rather than rehearsed small talk. He was handsome in an understated way, with kind eyes and a self-deprecating humor that seemed refreshing among the posturing peacocks who typically populated these events. Our relationship developed over 6 months of dinners, museum visits, long walks through the city's historic districts. He spoke about his family with a mixture of affection and mild exasperation that seemed normal, healthy even. His mother was particular about traditions. His father was stern but fair. His brother was competitive but loyal. His sister was dramatic but well-meaning. These descriptions painted a picture of a typical wealthy family, with typical wealthy family dynamics. Nothing in those early months suggested what I would actually encounter once I became part of the household. My father had been more cautious than I was. Alessandro Castellano had built his business empire by reading people with ruthless accuracy, and he spent our engagement period quietly investigating the Hartwells with the same thoroughness he would apply to a potential business acquisition. He never explicitly told me not to marry Michael. My father believed in allowing people to make their own choices, even choices he suspected might prove difficult. But he did insist on certain protections. The week before my wedding, my father called me into his study. The room smelled of leather and old books, the massive desk positioned to overlook the garden where I had played as a child. He poured 2 glasses of wine, a ritual we had shared since I turned 21, and gestured for me to sit in the chair across from him. His expression was serious but not unkind, the look of someone about to deliver information that was necessary but not entirely welcome. "Elena," he began, using my full name the way he did when conversations mattered, "I want to discuss your future, both the one you are choosing and the one you may need to protect." He slid a leather portfolio across the desk, the kind he used for important contracts. Inside were documents I recognized from years of watching him work. Stock certificates, property deeds, trust documents, letters of credit, an entire financial architecture laid out in careful detail. "This," he continued, tapping the portfolio, "represents your inheritance, but it also represents your independence. I am transferring these assets to you now before your marriage, so they remain solely yours regardless of what happens. The Hartwells are an old family with old money and older ideas about how the world should work. Michael seems like a good man and I hope he proves to be one. But his family operates according to certain rules that may not serve you well." I had started to protest, to say that Michael loved me and that I trusted him, but my father raised his hand gently. "I am not questioning his love or your judgment. I am ensuring that love is never your only option. You will own significant assets that exist entirely separate from your marriage. You will have income streams that do not depend on anyone's approval or generosity. You will have the ability to walk away from anything that becomes intolerable without sacrificing your security." He had pulled out another document then, one I had not expected. A prenuptial agreement, carefully drafted to protect both parties while ensuring that my premarital assets remained mine alone. "Michael's family will expect this," my father explained. "They will want to protect their wealth from anyone they perceive as an outsider. Let them have their protection. We will have ours. But Elena, this is important. Do not tell them the full extent of what you own. Let them make their assumptions. Let them believe whatever narrative makes them comfortable. Knowledge is power, and there is power in being underestimated." I had understood his reasoning intellectually, but I had not truly grasped the wisdom of it until I moved into the Hartwell mansion and met the family not as Michael's girlfriend but as his wife, a permanent fixture they could no longer dismiss once the evening ended. The first dinner as a resident of the household set the tone for everything that followed. The dining room was formal in a way that felt performative, with china that could not be placed in a dishwasher and crystal that required special handling. Michael's mother, Patricia Hartwell, sat at one end of the long table, her posture perfect, her expression pleasant in a way that somehow communicated displeasure. Michael's father, Richard, sat at the opposite end, largely silent, occasionally nodding when his wife made pronouncements about proper behavior or family standards. Michael's brother, Christopher, and his wife Vanessa sat on one side of the table. Christopher was louder than Michael, more aggressive in his humor, quicker to assert opinions as facts. Vanessa was elegant in an intimidating way, her beauty carefully maintained through obvious effort. Her conversation focused on luxury brands and exclusive experiences. She spoke about her charity work with the kind of casual superiority that made it clear she viewed philanthropy as a social obligation, rather than genuine concern for others. Michael's sister, Georgina, sat across from them, younger and still unmarried but equally invested in the family hierarchy. She had greeted me warmly enough during the wedding festivities, but now, with me seated as a permanent member of the household, her warmth had cooled into polite assessment. She watched me throughout the meal with the kind of attention that suggested she was cataloging every detail to discuss later with her mother. The conversation during that first dinner circled around topics that excluded me by design. They discussed people I had never met, events I had not attended, family history I could not share. When Michael tried to include me by asking about my day or my interests, his mother would redirect smoothly, asking him about business matters or family concerns that required his attention. The message was clear. I was present but not yet part of the inner circle, a guest who had overstayed her welcome by virtue of marriage. After dinner, Patricia invited me to join her for coffee in the sitting room, a smaller space decorated with antiques and family portraits. Michael had been pulled away by his father to discuss some business matter, leaving me alone with my new mother-in-law for the first time. She poured coffee from a silver service, the ritual precise and practiced, handing me a delicate cup that felt fragile in my hands. "I hope you will be happy here, Elena," she began, her voice carrying the kind of warmth that did not quite reach her eyes. "The Hartwell home has very particular rhythms, traditions that have been maintained for generations. Michael's father and I believe strongly in preserving what makes this family special. I trust you understand the importance of respecting those traditions." I nodded, sipping the coffee and waiting for her to continue. Patricia smiled, the expression tight and controlled. "Michael has mentioned that your father is in business, though he has been somewhat vague about the specifics. I do hope your background has prepared you for the kind of social obligations that come with being part of our family. The Hartwells have a reputation to maintain, and every member reflects on the whole." The subtext was impossible to miss. She was questioning whether I was sufficiently refined, sufficiently connected, sufficiently worthy of the family name. My father's warning echoed in my mind. Let them believe whatever narrative makes them comfortable. "My father taught me to value quality and discretion," I replied carefully. "I hope to honor the Hartwell name in the way you find appropriate." Patricia seemed satisfied with this response, or at least satisfied that I understood my position. "We will help you, of course. Vanessa can introduce you to the right charitable organizations. Georgina can ensure you are included in appropriate social circles. You will not be alone in learning what is expected." The offer sounded generous, but it was actually a declaration of control. They would teach me, shape me, mold me into whatever version of a Hartwell wife they deemed acceptable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Over the following weeks, the pattern solidified. I was given responsibilities that kept me busy but powerless. I was asked to organize small dinner parties but not to make decisions about guest lists or menus. I was invited to charity events but positioned as Vanessa's assistant rather than as a participant in my own right. I was included in family discussions but my opinions were acknowledged with the kind of patient condescension typically reserved for children who do not yet understand adult matters. Michael noticed some of this, particularly when his mother was most explicit in her corrections or his sister most pointed in her suggestions. He would apologize privately, assure me that his family meant well, promise that they would warm to me once they knew me better. I believed him because I wanted to, because the alternative was acknowledging that I had married into a family that would never see me as an equal regardless of how well I performed my assigned role. But while they were teaching me their traditions and evaluating my suitability, I was learning things they did not intend to teach. I was observing how the family actually functioned beneath the veneer of old money respectability. I was noticing who held real power and who merely performed it. I was documenting the small cruelties and casual dismissals that revealed character more accurately than any charitable donation or society page mention ever could. I maintained my father's businesses quietly, using the study that had been designated as my personal space, conducting calls and reviewing documents during the hours when the family assumed I was arranging flowers or writing thank you notes. My father's instructions had been clear. Keep the business separate. Use your maiden name for all professional matters. Do not volunteer information about your assets or activities. Let them make assumptions based on what they can see, which is only what you choose to show them. What they saw was a young woman who had married into their family with a modest wardrobe and no visible means of support beyond Michael's generosity. What they did not see were the property developments I was funding, the investment portfolios I was managing, the business decisions I was making that would eventually dwarf the Hartwell family's inherited but slowly diminishing wealth. My father had taught me that real power did not require announcement. It simply existed, patient and certain, waiting for the moment when it would matter most. That moment was still years away, but its foundation was being laid in every condescending correction, every dismissive comment, every assumption that I was fortunate to be tolerated in their magnificent home. They were building a narrative about who I was and what I was worth. I was building documentation about who they were and what they actually valued. Both projects proceeded simultaneously, invisible to each other, on a collision course that would eventually shatter their comfortable illusions. The first year of marriage passed in a blur of learned behaviors and careful performance. I mastered the art of blending into the Hartwell household, becoming what they expected while maintaining my separate identity in spaces they never thought to examine. I attended their social events with appropriate attire and acceptable conversation. I deferred to Patricia's preferences about household management. I supported Michael's career without outshining his contributions. I played the role so convincingly that they began to relax around me, to speak more freely, to reveal more of their true opinions and values. And I took notes. Not literal notes that could be discovered, but mental records of every slight, every dismissal, every moment when their courtesy masked contempt. I remembered which charities they supported primarily for social access rather than social good. I noticed which family friends were cultivated for connections rather than affection. I observed how they discussed people they considered beneath them, the casual cruelty of inherited privilege meeting perceived inferiority. I also noticed the financial cracks in the family's foundation. The Hartwell wealth was substantial but not unlimited, and it was being managed with more concern for appearances than for actual growth. Richard's business decisions were conservative to the point of stagnation. Christopher's ventures were flashy but poorly researched, losing money while generating impressive stories. The family's income was sufficient to maintain their lifestyle, but that lifestyle was expensive, and the gap between income and expenses was narrowing each year. My own wealth, meanwhile, was growing. My father's businesses were thriving under my management, and the investments I had made were performing beyond projections. I was acquiring properties in developing neighborhoods that would appreciate significantly over the next decade. I was funding startups led by brilliant people who had been overlooked by traditional investors. I was building an empire quietly, without announcements or celebrations, in a way that would eventually make the Hartwell family fortune look quaint by comparison. But none of this was visible to my in-laws. They saw me answer Michael's phone when his assistant was unavailable, and assumed I was playing secretary. They saw me review documents in the study and assumed I was managing household accounts. They saw my father visit occasionally and assumed he was a moderately successful businessman doting on his only child. They saw what they expected to see, and their expectations were limited by their assumptions about who deserved to have power and wealth. The second year brought subtle escalations. Patricia began making more direct suggestions about my appearance, my activities, my friendships. She framed these as helpful guidance, the kind of mentorship a mother-in-law should provide. But the underlying message was clear. I was still not quite right, still not quite polished enough, still not quite Hartwell enough despite carrying the name. Vanessa joined these improvement efforts enthusiastically, offering to take me shopping for appropriate clothes, suggesting aesthetic procedures that might enhance my natural features, recommending personal trainers who could help me achieve a more refined physique. I accepted some suggestions and deflected others, always maintaining the appearance of gratitude, while preserving my autonomy in ways they did not notice. I allowed Patricia to introduce me to her hairdresser but kept my own stylist for important occasions. I shopped with Vanessa but made my own purchasing decisions, often selecting less expensive items while she chose luxury brands, further cementing their impression that I was working within limited means. I joined the country club they recommended but spent most of my time there in the business center rather than at social events, using the privacy to conduct calls my father's associates without household interruption. Michael remained largely oblivious to these dynamics. He worked long hours at the family firm, came home tired, and interpreted my integration into his family's life as evidence that everything was proceeding well. When I mentioned specific incidents, he would minimize them, suggest I was being too sensitive, remind me that his mother meant well even when her delivery was harsh. He loved his family and he loved me, and he genuinely could not conceive that those two loves might be incompatible. I did not push the issue because I understood something Michael did not. His family would never accept me as an equal regardless of what I did or how I behaved. Their hierarchy was fixed, their worldview settled. I could perform perfectly for 50 years and still be the outsider who had married in, the woman whose value was measured by her usefulness and her compliance. Pushing Michael to choose between me and his family would only create conflict without changing the underlying dynamic. Better to document, to observe, to prepare for an eventual reckoning I could not yet fully envision. The third year brought pregnancy, and with it, a temporary elevation in status that proved more revealing than any direct confrontation could have been. Patricia was delighted at the prospect of a grandchild, particularly after the doctors confirmed we were expecting a boy who would carry on the Hartwell name. Suddenly I was valuable in a way I had not been before, not for myself but for my biological function. The family's treatment of me improved noticeably, not because their opinion of me had changed but because I was now serving a purpose they valued. Vanessa threw an elaborate baby shower, inviting society women who had previously ignored me at events. Patricia began including me in family decisions about nursery decoration and nanny selection, though her inclusion consisted primarily of informing me what had already been decided. Richard acknowledged my presence at family dinners with slightly more attention, asking perfunctory questions about my health and comfort. Even Christopher managed moments of courtesy, though his compliments about my changing body felt more objectifying than kind. I understood that this improved treatment was conditional and temporary. I was being valued for my womb and the air it carried, not for any intrinsic worth. Once the child was born and the initial excitement faded, I would return to my previous status unless I could establish permanent value through perfect motherhood and continued deference. The realization was clarifying rather than devastating. I stopped hoping for their genuine acceptance and focused instead on protecting my child from the same conditional love I was experiencing. My son Marco was born on a clear autumn morning, arriving with strong lungs and my father's dark eyes. The hospital room filled with flowers sent by Patricia's social circle, ostentatious arrangements that communicated status rather than joy. Michael was attentive and loving, genuinely moved by fatherhood in ways that made me remember why I had married him. My father visited with quiet pride, holding his grandson with careful tenderness, whispering in Italian the same blessing his own father had given him. But the Hartwells' response to Marco's arrival confirmed my observations about their values. Patricia immediately began discussing boarding schools, planning his childhood around institutions that would properly socialize him into their class. Vanessa offered unsolicited advice about nannies and scheduling, emphasizing the importance of maintaining my appearance and social obligations rather than being consumed by motherhood. Richard established a trust fund in Marco's name, a generous gesture that came with explicit expectations about how my son would be raised and what roles he would eventually assume in the family business. No one asked me what I wanted from my child. No one inquired about my parenting philosophy or my hopes for his future. They simply informed me of decisions they had made, framing their plans as traditions I should be grateful to access. And perhaps I should have been grateful. They were offering my son opportunities many children would never have, access to education and connections that could open any door. But those opportunities came with invisible chains, expectations that would shape Marco's entire life, according to someone else's vision, rather than his own potential. I began to understand that my father's insistence on financial independence was not just about protecting myself. It was about protecting my son. If I were truly dependent on the Hartwells' generosity, I would have no leverage to advocate for different choices, no ability to insist on different values, no power to raise Marco according to my own judgment rather than their dictates. My hidden wealth, the empire I was building in secret, was not just an escape route for me. It was insurance that my son would have options beyond the path his paternal family had already planned. During Marco's first year, I increased my business activities, working during his naps and after he slept, building wealth with even greater focus because I now had someone to protect beyond myself. My father's health was beginning to decline, subtle signs he dismissed but I recognized. He would need to begin transferring more responsibility to me, preparing me to take full control of our holdings. I needed to be ready, not just capable but positioned to assume complete authority over an empire whose scope even my father had not fully disclosed to me. The fourth year brought my father's cancer diagnosis. Pancreatic stage 4 prognosis measured in months rather than years. He told me over lunch at his favorite restaurant, delivering the news with the same calm matter-of-factness he brought to business challenges. We would fight it, of course, pursue every treatment, maintain hope where hope was appropriate. But we would also be practical. He began the process of transferring full control to me, teaching me aspects of the business I had not yet managed, introducing me to partners and associates who would need to trust my leadership after he was gone. The Hartwells expressed appropriate sympathy about my father's illness, but their concern was performative rather than genuine. They had met Alessandro Castellano several times during my marriage, and they had never quite known what to make of him. He was clearly successful but not in ways they fully understood or respected. He lacked their social polish, spoke with a slight accent they could not place, and showed no interest in the status markers they valued. They offered to help with whatever I needed, but their offers were vague and unspecific, the kind of courtesy that did not expect to be accepted. I did not tell them about the late nights I spent at my father's bedside, discussing business strategy between pain medication cycles. I did not mention the legal documents we were finalizing, the transfers of power that were occurring while they assumed I was simply grieving a dying parent. I did not share the conversations where my father extracted my promises to protect Marco, to use the wealth I would inherit to ensure my son's freedom, to never let the Hartwell's limited vision limit his possibilities. My father died on a Thursday morning in spring, with me holding his hand and Marco asleep in a carrier beside the hospital bed. His last words were in Italian, a language the Hartwells did not speak, a final privacy between us. He told me he was proud of the woman I had become, proud of the mother I had proven to be, proud of the business leader I was ready to be. He told me to be strong but not hard, to be generous but not foolish, to be patient but not passive. He told me that wealth was only valuable if it bought freedom, and that I should never settle for less than complete freedom. The funeral was large, attended by business associates and community members the Hartwells did not recognize. They stood beside me looking uncomfortable, uncertain of their place among people who clearly respected my father but did not defer to Hartwell family status. They heard my eulogy delivered in both English and Italian, saw the tears of employees whose lives my father had changed, witnessed the respect of partners whose fortunes he had built alongside his own. For perhaps the first time, they glimpsed that Alessandro Castellano had been someone more significant than they had assumed, though they still could not grasp the full scope of his empire. After the funeral, during the customary gathering at my father's home, the will reading occurred in his study. The Hartwells attended out of politeness, expecting small bequests or sentimental items. What they heard instead was a complete revelation of everything I had inherited, everything I now controlled, everything I had owned separately throughout my entire marriage while they patronized me and pitted Michael for marrying a woman without means. The lawyer's voice was steady and professional as he detailed the full extent of my inheritance, which was itself only a portion of what I already owned. Castellano Industries, with its diverse holdings in real estate development, technology ventures, and international trade. The property portfolio spanning multiple cities and countries. The investment funds that had been quietly outperforming market indices for 2 decades. The trusts established for Marco that made the Hartwell Family Trust look modest by comparison. The personal assets that included art, jewelry, and collectibles worth more than the Hartwell mansion itself. Patricia's face went white as the recitation continued. Richard's expression moved from polite attention to confused concern to something approaching panic. Christopher and Vanessa exchanged glances that communicated shock and betrayal, as if I had deliberately deceived them rather than simply maintained privacy about matters that were none of their business. Georgina stared at me with her mouth slightly open, her careful social training momentarily abandoned in the face of information that shattered every assumption she had made. Michael looked at me with a mixture of emotions I could not fully parse. Surprise certainly that I had kept so much from him. Pride perhaps that his wife was more than he had realized. Confusion about why I had allowed his family to treat me as they did when I had resources that could have commanded respect. Hurt that I had not trusted him with the truth. All of these reactions flickered across his face in rapid succession as the lawyer concluded his recitation with the words I had been waiting to hear. These assets are held solely by Elena Maria Castellano Hartwell, established as her separate property prior to marriage under the prenuptial agreement executed by all parties. Mrs. Hartwell has complete discretion over their management and distribution. Her late father specifically directed that these holdings be revealed at this time to ensure all interested parties understand her complete financial independence and decision-making authority. The silence that followed was profound. We sat in that study surrounded by my father's books and his memory, the Hartwells processing information that fundamentally changed their understanding of who I was and what power I held. I watched them realize that every dismissive comment, every condescending suggestion, every assumption of superiority had been built on complete ignorance of reality. I had never needed their approval, their guidance, their tolerance. I had chosen to accept it, And that choice had always been revocable. Patricia recovered first, her social training asserting itself even in crisis. "Elena dear," she began, her voice carrying a warmth I had never heard before. "We had no idea. Your father was so discreet and you never mentioned. You must understand we simply did not know." The words were technically an apology but actually an excuse. A reframing that positioned their treatment of me as a reasonable response to incomplete information, rather than as a character flaw revealed by how they treated someone they believed had less power than themselves. I responded with the same neutral courtesy I had maintained for 5 years. My father valued privacy in business matters. I saw no reason to discuss my holdings when they had no impact on my role in your family. The statement was true but incomplete. I had seen many reasons not to discuss my holdings, primarily the valuable information I had gained by being underestimated. Their treatment of me under the assumption I was powerless had revealed exactly who they were when they believed there would be no consequences. The gathering concluded shortly after, the Hartwells departing with assurances that we would speak soon, that there was much to discuss, that they hoped I understood their surprise was simply about the unexpected nature of the revelation. Michael lingered, torn between leaving with his family and staying with me. I told him I needed time alone to grieve my father, which was true even if it was not the complete truth. He left reluctantly, glancing back as if seeing me for the first time, uncertain how to reconcile the wife he thought he knew with the woman who had just been revealed. I stood in my father's study after they all left, Marco asleep in my arms, surrounded by the evidence of my inheritance and my independence. The chess that my father had used to teach me strategy sat on the corner of his desk, the pieces arranged in a game we had never finished. I could see his move, the brilliant trap he had been setting, patient and inevitable. He had been teaching me all along, not just about business but about power, about patience, about the wisdom of being underestimated until the moment when truth would matter most. That moment had arrived. The Hartwells now knew what I owned, but they did not yet know what I would do with that knowledge. They assumed I suspected that this was simply an adjustment, that we would recalibrate our relationships based on new information but continue essentially as before. They could not imagine that I might choose differently, that having shown them my hand, I might also be preparing to leave the table entirely. Their failure of imagination was about to become their most expensive mistake. The inequality that defined my relationship with the Hartwell family did not emerge fully formed on the day I moved into their mansion. It was constructed gradually, through accumulated moments that each seemed reasonable in isolation but together formed an architecture of diminishment that became the foundation of how they saw me, and how they expected me to see myself. My first encounter with Michael Hartwell occurred at the Morrison Foundation Gala, an annual event that drew the city's philanthropic elite to support arts education in underserved communities. My father had purchased a table as he did every year, not for social positioning but because he genuinely believed in the cause. He had grown up poor in southern Italy, and education had been his pathway out of circumstances that could have defined his entire life. He never forgot what access to learning had meant for him, and he gave generously to organizations that provided similar access to others. I attended these events as my father's representative, a role I had assumed after completing my MBA. At 26, I was young enough that people often mistook me for a socialite daughter rather than a serious businesswoman, an assumption I had learned to use strategically. People said things around me they would never say to Alessandro Castellano directly, providing valuable intelligence about potential partners and competitors. I dressed well but not ostentatiously, spoke when spoken to but rarely initiated conversation, and observed everything with the careful attention my father had trained me to employ. Michael approached me during the cocktail hour preceding dinner. I was standing near the bar, having just declined an overpriced glass of champagne in favor of sparkling water, when I noticed him watching me with an expression of genuine curiosity rather than the predatory interest some men brought to these gatherings. He was handsome in an understated way, tall with sandy brown hair and hazel eyes that suggested intelligence and humor. His suit was expensive but not flashy, tailored perfectly but worn with the casual comfort of someone accustomed to fine clothing rather than someone trying to impress. He introduced himself simply, offering his hand and his name without the elaborate credentials some people felt compelled to recite. We spoke about the foundation's work, and I was surprised by his actual knowledge of their programs rather than just the social cachet of supporting them. He had volunteered as a tutor during college, he told me, working with high school students who were the first in their families to pursue higher education. The experience had been humbling, he said, revealing how much privilege he had taken for granted, and how much talent existed in communities that lacked resources rather than ability. I found myself genuinely enjoying the conversation, appreciating his apparent authenticity in an environment where most interactions felt performative. We discussed education policy, the challenges of scaling successful programs, the tension between donor preferences and actual community needs. He listened when I spoke rather than simply waiting for his turn to talk, asked follow-up questions that suggested he was actually processing what I said, and shared his own observations with a self-awareness that seemed refreshing. When dinner was announced, Michael asked if he could call me sometime, perhaps take me to dinner when we could have a proper conversation without the noise and interruption of a gala. I agreed, giving him my card with my personal number handwritten on the back. As I walked to my father's table, I felt something I had not experienced often in these settings. Hope that this man might be different from the entitled heirs and calculating social climbers who typically populated my demographic of eligible bachelors. Our courtship unfolded over the following months with a deliberateness that felt mature rather than impulsive. Michael took me to museums and small restaurants where we could talk without performance. We walked through historic neighborhoods discussing architecture and urban development. We attended concerts and plays, discovering shared tastes in art that valued substance over spectacle. He was intelligent without being condescending, successful without being arrogant, and comfortable with silences in a way that suggested security rather than awkwardness. He spoke about his family in terms that seemed affectionate and normal. His father ran the family investment firm with conservative competence. His mother was devoted to maintaining family traditions and social connections. His older brother Christopher worked in the firm and would eventually take over leadership. His younger sister Georgina was still finding her direction but was involved in various charitable endeavors. The family was close, he explained, perhaps more formal than some modern families but bound by genuine love and mutual support. Michael introduced me to his family 3 months into our relationship, inviting me to Sunday dinner at the Hartwell mansion. I dressed carefully for the occasion, selecting a dress that was elegant but not flashy, classic rather than trendy, expensive enough to signal quality but not so expensive as to suggest I was trying too hard. My father had taught me that first impressions were constructed through countless small details, and I paid attention to all of them. The mansion impressed me with its scale and history, though I was careful not to appear too impressed. My father's home was large and beautifully appointed, but it lacked the generational weight of the Hartwell estate. Everything in their home communicated legacy, from the portraits of ancestors lining the hallway to the furniture that had been inherited, rather than purchased. I understood immediately that I was entering a family with a strong sense of lineage and identity, a family that valued continuity and tradition above innovation and change. Patricia Hartwell greeted me at the door with a smile that was warm on the surface but assessing underneath. She was elegantly dressed in clothing that was clearly expensive but understated, her jewelry minimal but exquisite, her hair styled in a way that suggested professional maintenance while appearing effortless. She welcomed me graciously, commenting on my dress with a compliment that somehow also conveyed that she had noticed every detail and formed judgments about each one. Richard Hartwell was cordial but distant, shaking my hand firmly but without particular warmth. He asked polite questions about my background and education, listening to my answers with the partial attention of someone performing a social duty, rather than genuine interest. Christopher and his wife Vanessa were already present, having apparently arrived early. Christopher resembled Michael but with harder edges, his humor more aggressive, his confidence more pronounced. Vanessa was beautiful in a way that required significant effort to maintain. Her appearance flawless but somehow artificial, like a magazine photograph brought to three-dimensional life. Georgina arrived last, apologizing for her tardiness with a kind of charming self-deprecation that suggested she was often late and often forgiven. She was friendly in her greeting, asking questions about my work and seeming genuinely interested in my answers. I found myself liking her initially, appreciating what seemed like authentic warmth in contrast to her mother's calculated courtesy and her sister-in-law's cool assessment. Dinner proceeded with the formal ritual of a performance everyone had rehearsed many times. The food was excellent, prepared by a cook who clearly understood the family's preferences. The conversation flowed through established topics, family updates and social news and business discussions that excluded me by virtue of referencing people and situations I knew nothing about. Michael tried to include me, asking me questions or explaining references I might not understand, but these efforts only highlighted my outsider status, rather than mitigating it. I observed more than I participated, noting the family's dynamics with the analytical attention my father had trained me to employ. Patricia clearly held significant power despite Richard's titular position as family patriarch. Her opinions shaped family decisions, her preferences determined social calendars, her approval or disapproval influenced how other family members responded to situations. Christopher deferred to her constantly while positioning himself as his father's heir in business matters. Vanessa watched Patricia carefully, mimicking her mannerisms and echoing her opinions, clearly understanding that her position in the family depended on the older woman's favor. Georgina operated with more independence, occasionally disagreeing with her mother in ways that were allowed because she was the youngest and still unmarried. But even her disagreements stayed within acceptable bounds, never challenging fundamental family values or seriously disrupting the established hierarchy. Michael occupied a middle position, valued but not central, loved but not relied upon in the way Christopher was positioned to be relied upon as future leader. After dinner, Patricia invited me to join her in the conservatory for coffee while the men retired to Richard's study. Vanessa and Georgina came as well, creating a female cohort that felt both welcoming and evaluative. Patricia asked about my family, my education, my interests and ambitions. Her questions were polite but probing, designed to assess my suitability for inclusion in their world. I answered carefully, providing information that was true but incomplete, revealing enough to satisfy curiosity while maintaining privacy about matters I had been trained never to discuss casually. When Patricia asked about my father's business, I described it in general terms. Import-export, primarily with European partners, some real estate investments, various business interests that kept him occupied. The description was accurate but dramatically understated, painting a picture of modest success rather than the empire Alessandro Castellano had actually built. Patricia seemed satisfied with this answer, filing it away in whatever mental framework she used to categorize people into hierarchies of importance and influence. Vanessa asked about my work, and I explained that I helped my father with his businesses, managing various projects and relationships. Again, this was true but incomplete. I did not mention that I held executive authority over multiple companies, that I made investment decisions involving millions of dollars, that I had built successful ventures my father had not even initiated. I presented myself as a dutiful daughter assisting her father rather than as an independent businesswoman with my own portfolio and power. Georgina asked lighter questions about my interests and hobbies, and we discovered shared appreciation for art and literature. This connection felt genuine, and I found myself enjoying our conversation in a way I had not enjoyed the more formal exchanges with Patricia and Vanessa. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that I might find an ally in my future sister-in-law, someone who could help me navigate the family's complex dynamics with friendship rather than constant vigilance. The evening concluded with expressions of pleasure at having met me in hopes that we would see each other again soon. Michael drove me home, asking eagerly what I thought of his family. I told him they seemed lovely, which was the safe answer rather than the honest one. I could see he was relieved, having apparently worried that his family's formality might be off-putting. He apologized for how much they had talked about people and events I did not know, promising that I would feel more included once I became more familiar with their world. I smiled and assured him that I understood, that every family had its own language and references, that I looked forward to learning more. What I did not say was that I had recognized something concerning in that first dinner, a pattern of interaction that suggested the Hartwells operated according to rigid hierarchies where acceptance was conditional and status was constantly negotiated. I had seen enough to know that joining this family would require careful navigation, but I was young and in love and convinced that Michael's genuine kindness would be enough to balance whatever challenges his family dynamics might present. My father was less optimistic when I described the evening to him the next day. We sat in his study as we always did when I needed to process important experiences, and he listened with the focused attention he brought to complex business negotiations. When I finished my account, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Elena, I want you to be happy," he began carefully. Michael seems like a good man, and if he makes you happy, then I am happy. But I need you to understand something about families like the Hartwells. They are not bad people, but they operate according to rules that may not serve you well. They value lineage over merit, tradition over innovation, appearance over substance. These values are deeply embedded in how they see the world and how they will see you. I started to protest, to say that Michael was different, that he valued the same things I valued. My father raised his hand gently. Michael may be different in his individual values, but he is still part of a family system that will exert pressure on both of you. That system will want to shape you into whatever they believe a Hartwell wife should be. The question you need to answer is whether you are willing to be shaped, and if so, how much of yourself you are willing to reshape to fit their expectations. His words stayed with me throughout the continued courtship and engagement, surfacing in moments when the Hartwell family's expectations became clear. When Patricia suggested vendors for our wedding with the unspoken expectation that I would use her recommendations rather than make my own choices. When Vanessa offered to take me shopping for my trousseau with the implicit message that my current wardrobe was insufficient. When Georgina mentioned the clubs and organizations I should join to properly represent the family in social circles. Each suggestion was framed as helpful guidance, and perhaps it was intended that way. But the cumulative effect was to communicate that I was not quite acceptable as I was, that I needed improvement in education to meet Hartwell standards. The message was never cruel or explicit, but it was constant and clear. I was marrying into a family that would love me conditionally, would accept me provisionally, would include me only to the extent that I conformed to their vision of what I should be. Michael noticed some of these dynamics and tried to moderate them, telling his mother that I should be allowed to make my own choices, reminding Vanessa that I was an adult woman with my own taste and judgment. But his interventions were gentle and easily deflected. Patricia would acknowledge his point while continuing to offer guidance that felt mandatory despite being phrased as optional. Vanessa would agree that I had good instincts while still insisting that she knew better what would be appropriate for someone in my new position. I chose my battles carefully during this period, accepting some suggestions and quietly declining others, establishing boundaries without creating conflict. I used Patricia's recommended wedding planner, but made my own decisions about the ceremony and reception. I shopped with Vanessa but purchased items based on my own judgment, rather than her enthusiastic recommendations. I joined one of Georgina's clubs but maintained my own friendships and interests outside the Hartwell social circle. These small assertions of independence were noted and remarked upon, always with the framing that I was being slightly stubborn or charmingly independent-minded, never with the acknowledgement that I had the right to make my own choices without requiring their approval. The pattern was subtle but clear. The Hartwells expected compliance disguised as cooperation, expected me to accept their guidance while believing I had made my own decisions. My father observed all of this with growing concern, though he respected my choice to proceed with the marriage. He insisted on the prenuptial agreement that protected my assets, and he insisted with equal firmness that I not reveal the full extent of those assets to Michael or his family. Let them make their assumptions, he advised. Let them believe you are marrying Michael because you need his family's support and status. Their assumptions will reveal how they treat people they perceive as having less power than themselves. That information will be valuable, though I hope you never need to use it. The wedding was beautiful and formal. Exactly what Patricia had envisioned and largely what I had wanted as well. I wore a dress that cost more than most people's cars, walked down an aisle lined with flowers that had been flown in from 3 different countries, and exchanged vows in front of 400 guests representing the intersection of Hartwell family connections and Castellano business relationships. My father walked me down the aisle with quiet pride, and I saw tears in his eyes when he placed my hand in Michael's. I understood later that those tears were not just about losing his daughter to marriage but about worry for what kind of life I was choosing. The reception proceeded with champagne and dancing and speeches that celebrated the joining of 2 families. But the 2 families being joined were not equal in the eyes of most guests. The Hartwells were known, established, part of the social infrastructure of the city's elite. The Castellanos were successful but not fully understood, respected for my father's business acumen but not fully included in the circles where the Hartwells moved with easy familiarity. Several guests made comments to me during the reception that revealed these hierarchies, congratulating me on my excellent match, expressing happiness that I was joining such a wonderful family, speaking as if I were the primary beneficiary of this union rather than one half of a partnership between equals. I smiled and thanked them, playing the role of grateful bride, while mentally noting who made which assumptions and what those assumptions revealed about their values. My father had taught me to see social events as information-gathering opportunities, and I gathered a great deal of information during my own wedding. I learned who genuinely wished me well, and who viewed my marriage as a social climbing achievement. I learned which of Michael's friends saw me as a person, and which saw me as a decorative addition to his life. I learned which family members welcomed me authentically, and which welcomed me provisionally, contingent on my future performance of appropriate Hartwell behaviors. The honeymoon provided a brief respite from family dynamics. 2 weeks in Italy where Michael and I could simply be ourselves without the weight of expectation and observation. We visited the region where my father had grown up, and I showed Michael the village where the Castellano family had lived for generations before my grandfather emigrated to America seeking better opportunities. Michael was charmed by the simplicity and beauty of the countryside, by the warmth of distant relatives who still lived there, by the food and wine and slower pace of life. I felt more myself during those 2 weeks than I had felt in months of wedding planning and family negotiations. Away from his family's influence, Michael relaxed into a version of himself that was easier and more genuine. We talked about our future, about the children we hoped to have, about the life we would build together. Those conversations were full of hope and possibility, unmarred by the complications I knew awaited us when we returned home to begin our married life in the Hartwell mansion. The decision to live with his family rather than establishing our own household had been presented as temporary and practical. Michael was working long hours to prove himself in the family firm, and living at the mansion would allow us to save money while we looked for the right property to purchase. Patricia had assured me that we would have our own wing of the house, complete privacy, no intrusion into our married life. The arrangement would last perhaps a year, just until we found the perfect home and Michael's position at the firm was more established. I had agreed to this plan despite my father's advice to insist on our own space from the beginning. I told myself that a year was not so long, that living with Michael's family would help me understand them better, that the financial savings would be useful even though I personally did not need them. I convinced myself that this was a reasonable compromise, a way of honoring Michael's family while maintaining my own identity and independence. What I did not fully grasp until I moved into the Hartwell mansion as a permanent resident was how different I would be treated as a daughter-in-law compared to how I had been treated as Michael's girlfriend. As a girlfriend, I had been a guest, someone to be impressed and courted, someone whose approval Michael's family wanted to secure. As a wife, I became something to be shaped and managed, someone whose behavior reflected on the family and therefore required supervision and correction. The shift began subtly during my first week as a resident. Patricia would make casual comments about household routines and expectations, framing them as helpful information for someone new to the household. The staff answers to me regarding household matters, she explained pleasantly. So any requests you have should go through me to ensure consistency and proper management. Dinner is served at 7 each evening unless Richard has a business commitment, and we maintain certain standards regarding dress and punctuality that I know you will want to honor. Vanessa would offer guidance about social obligations, arriving at my door with invitations that required responses and events that required attendance. As a Hartwell woman, you represent the family at these functions, she explained with the patient tone of a teacher instructing a student. I can help you understand which events are truly important and which can be declined, which people you need to cultivate relationships with, and which are less significant to our social positioning. Even Georgina, whose friendship I had hoped might be genuine and uncomplicated, began to offer suggestions about how I spent my time and what activities were appropriate for someone in my position. The garden club meets on Tuesdays and would love to have you, she mentioned casually. Several of us volunteer at the museum on Thursday mornings, which is a wonderful way to stay connected with the right people. You might want to consider joining the symphony board. It is one of the more prestigious commitments and would help establish your presence in the community. Each suggestion was reasonable on its surface. The activities mentioned were worthwhile, the people involved were influential, the causes supported were legitimate. But the cumulative effect was to fill my time with obligations chosen by others, to shape my days according to their vision of what a Hartwell wife should do rather than what I might want to do based on my own interests and priorities. My own work, managing my father's businesses and my own investments, was never mentioned or acknowledged as a legitimate use of my time. When I spent hours in my study on phone calls and reviewing documents, the family seemed to view it as an eccentric hobby rather than as serious professional work. This dismissal of my professional identity was perhaps the most consistent element of my early experience as a Hartwell wife. Michael knew I worked with my father's businesses, but even he did not fully understand the scope of my responsibilities or the significance of my role. When I mentioned needing to travel for business meetings, he seemed surprised and slightly uncomfortable, suggesting that perhaps those trips could be postponed or that my father's other associates could handle whatever needed to be done. When I took calls during family time, Patricia would make subtle comments about the importance of being present and engaged with loved ones rather than distracted by external demands. The message was clear and consistent. My professional work was less important than my social obligations as a Hartwell family member. My own judgment about how to spend my time was less reliable than their guidance about appropriate activities and commitments. My identity as Elena Castellano, businesswoman and investor, was less valued than my new identity as Elena Hartwell, wife and future mother who should be focused on family and social responsibilities. I did not confront these dynamics directly during the early months of my marriage. I continued my work quietly, carving out time when the family was occupied with their own activities, conducting business in ways that did not require their acknowledgement or approval. I attended some of the social events they deemed important, while declining others with polite excuses. I participated in household routines when convenient while maintaining my own schedule when necessary. I sought a balance between accommodation and autonomy, trying to preserve my sense of self while also building a life with Michael that honored his family connections. But the balance was increasingly difficult to maintain. Every accommodation I made seemed to establish a new baseline expectation rather than earning credit I could use for future independence. Every time I deferred to Patricia's preferences or accepted Vanessa's guidance, they seemed to conclude that I had finally understood how things should be done and would continue operating according to their framework. Every assertion of my own judgment or preference was met with surprise and subtle disapproval, as if I were being unnecessarily difficult about matters that should be simple. The inequality was built into the structure of how the family operated, and that structure had been established long before I arrived. The Hartwell family had clear hierarchies and clear rules. Patricia's preferences carried weight that overrode individual desires. Family image and reputation mattered more than individual comfort or authentic self-expression. Tradition and continuity were valued above innovation or personal growth. These were not evil values, but they were values that left little room for someone like me, someone who had been raised to think independently, to value competence over pedigree, to build rather than simply maintain. I began to understand that my father had been right to worry. The Hartwells were not bad people, but they operated according to rules that fundamentally conflicted with how I understood myself and my place in the world. They wanted me to be grateful for inclusion in their family, to see my marriage to Michael as an elevation rather than a partnership between equals. They expected me to defer to their superior knowledge about how to live properly, to accept their guidance as the gift they believed it to be rather than as the control it actually represented. And the most challenging aspect of this inequality was that it was largely invisible to Michael. He saw his mother's involvement in my life as motherly affection. He interpreted Vanessa's guidance as sisterly support. He understood Georgina's suggestions as friendly help. He could not see what I saw because he had never been on the receiving end of this kind of conditional acceptance. As a Hartwell by birth, he belonged automatically. His value was inherent, his place secure. He had never had to perform or prove himself worthy of inclusion because his inclusion was guaranteed by blood and lineage. I, on the other hand, would always be the woman who married in, the outsider who required education and improvement, the addition to the family who needed to demonstrate her worthiness through compliance and performance. This reality became clearer with each passing month, each accumulated incident of casual dismissal or subtle correction. I was building documentation in my mind, creating a record of how they treated someone they perceived as having less power than themselves, gathering evidence I did not yet know how I would use but understood I needed to preserve. The foundation of inequality was being laid through hundreds of small moments that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively revealed a system designed to maintain hierarchy and control. I was learning that acceptance in the Hartwell family was always conditional, always provisional, always contingent on continued performance of behaviors they deemed appropriate. And I was beginning to understand that my father's insistence on protecting my financial independence was not paranoia but wisdom, preparation for a moment when I might need to choose between being true to myself and being acceptable to a family that would never fully accept me as an equal regardless of how perfectly I performed the role they had written for me. The transformation from Elena Castellano to Elena Hartwell was not simply a matter of changing my legal name. It was a gradual reconstruction of identity, a process through which I internalized the role the Hartwell family needed me to play while simultaneously maintaining a separate self that existed in spaces they never thought to examine. I became two people occupying the same body, the compliant daughter-in-law who attended charity luncheons and the shrewd businesswoman who made million-dollar investment decisions, and the skill with which I managed this duality became both my greatest strength and my most exhausting burden. The identity I constructed as a Hartwell wife was carefully calibrated to meet their expectations without completely erasing who I actually was. I learned to dress in the understated elegance Patricia favored, selecting classic pieces that would not draw attention or suggest I was trying too hard. I adopted the measured speech patterns that characterized Hartwell family conversation, speaking with certainty about trivial matters while expressing appropriate deference about important ones. I mastered the art of the gracious smile, the polite deflection, the strategic silence that allowed others to fill conversational space with their own assumptions and preferences. This performed identity felt foreign initially, like wearing clothing that did not quite fit but would have to suffice until alterations could be made. I would catch glimpses of myself in mirrors throughout the mansion and experience a moment of disconnection, seeing a woman who looked like me but moved through the world with a careful restraint I had never practiced before. My natural inclination was toward directness, toward stating preferences clearly and making decisions quickly. The Hartwell way required indirection, required suggesting rather than stating, hinting rather than declaring, always maintaining the appearance of seeking input and consensus even when outcomes had already been determined. I studied the women in the family with the same analytical attention I had brought to business case studies during my MBA program. Patricia was the master class, a woman who wielded enormous power while maintaining the fiction that she was simply supporting her husband and preserving family traditions. She never gave orders directly. She made observations about how things had always been done, asked questions that contained their own answers, expressed concerns that functioned as prohibitions. Her authority was absolute precisely because it was never overtly claimed, never subject to direct challenge because it was never directly asserted. Vanessa had learned this system imperfectly, still too obvious in her manipulations, too eager to be seen exercising influence. She would make pronouncements disguised as suggestions, offer guidance that was clearly meant to be followed, and then seem hurt when her advice was not immediately adopted. Her mistakes taught me what not to do, showed me the difference between performing power and actually holding it. Patricia wielded influence so naturally that people complied without realizing they were complying. Vanessa demanded compliance and then had to manage the resentment that demands inevitably generated. Georgina represented a different approach entirely, leveraging charm and apparent helplessness to achieve her objectives. She would present herself as confused or overwhelmed by decisions, soliciting help that positioned others as authorities while actually guiding them toward conclusions she had already reached. Her strategy worked remarkably well in social contexts, where people enjoyed feeling useful and knowledgeable. I observed her deploying this technique repeatedly, watching grown men and accomplished women fall over themselves to assist this lovely young woman who seemed so genuinely grateful for their wisdom. I adopted elements from each of these approaches while developing my own variation that felt more authentic to who I was. I learned to frame my preferences as questions, asking Patricia whether she thought a particular approach might work rather than announcing my intention to pursue it. I discovered that providing two options, one clearly inferior to the other, created the illusion of seeking input while actually controlling the outcome. I mastered the art of enthusiastic agreement with modifications, accepting the general direction someone suggested while subtly altering the specifics in ways that better served my actual goals. This performance required constant vigilance and extraordinary emotional labor. I had to monitor every word, every gesture, every expression to ensure I was projecting the appropriate version of myself. I had to suppress my natural reactions, my immediate responses, my authentic feelings in favor of curated responses that maintained the fiction of the harmonious Hartwell daughter-in-law. The effort was exhausting in ways I had not anticipated, creating a persistent low-grade stress that never fully dissipated even during moments of privacy and rest. But the performance also generated genuine competence in areas I had not previously mastered. I became exceptionally skilled at reading social dynamics, at detecting the unspoken tensions and alliances that shaped family interactions. I developed an acute sensitivity to tone and body language, able to discern when apparent agreement masked resentment or when enthusiastic support concealed reservation. I learned to navigate complex social situations with a grace I had not previously possessed, understanding instinctively when to speak and when to remain silent, when to engage and when to observe. These skills proved valuable in my business life as well, though I was careful never to let the Hartwell see that connection. The same emotional intelligence that helped me manage Patricia's expectations served me brilliantly in negotiating complex deals with partners who brought their own agendas and unstated objectives. The patience I had developed waiting for appropriate moments to assert my preferences in family discussions translated directly to investment strategies that required waiting for market conditions to align with my thesis. The ability to maintain composure under stress, while managing multiple competing priorities, became one of my greatest professional assets. My business identity remained largely hidden from the Hartwell family, operating in parallel to my domestic role but rarely intersecting with it. I maintained my father's companies and my own ventures through a combination of careful time management and deliberate misdirection. I would schedule important calls during the hours when the family was occupied with their own activities, conducting negotiations from my study, while they assumed I was managing household correspondence or planning social events. I traveled for business by framing trips as visits to my father or personal errands, never emphasizing the professional purposes that actually motivated these journeys. The study that had been designated as my private space became my command center, the one room in the mansion where I could be fully myself without performance or pretense. I had decorated it with furniture from my father's home, surrounding myself with familiar objects that reminded me of who I was beyond the Hartwell identity. My desk held multiple monitors displaying market data, property portfolios, and communication platforms that connected me to business associates around the world. The bookshelves contained technical manuals and industry analyses rather than the decorative volumes that filled the mansion's library. The walls displayed architectural drawings of developments I was funding rather than the landscape paintings that dominated the rest of the house. When I closed the door to that study, I could shed the Hartwell persona and return to Elena Castellano, the woman my father had trained to build and manage an empire. I would review acquisition proposals with the same critical analysis I had learned at his side, challenging assumptions and demanding better data before committing capital. I would conduct video conferences with development teams, providing strategic direction and holding people accountable for commitments they had made. I would analyze market trends and competitive dynamics, making investment decisions that would generate returns the Hartwells could not imagine, because they had never seen me make them. This compartmentalization of identity created a strange doubling of experience where I was simultaneously powerful and powerless, respected and dismissed, successful and struggling. In my study, I was Elena Castellano, CEO and investor, making decisions that affected hundreds of employees and influenced markets worth billions of dollars. In the Hartwell drawing room, I was Elena Hartwell, dutiful daughter-in-law, accepting guidance about which florist to use for the spring garden party and which charity auction deserved my volunteer hours. The dissonance between these two versions of myself was profound and disorienting, requiring constant mental adjustment as I moved between spaces and roles. I told myself that this division was temporary, that once Michael and I established our own household, I would be able to integrate these identities more fully. I convinced myself that the performance I was delivering was strategic rather than necessary, a choice I was making rather than a requirement I was meeting. I believed that maintaining harmony with Michael's family, while building my own empire, represented sophisticated emotional intelligence, rather than unsustainable self-denial. These rationalizations allowed me to continue functioning in both worlds without confronting the fundamental incompatibility between them. The arrival of pregnancy added new dimensions to my already complex identity. Suddenly I was valuable to the Hartwell family in a way I had not been before, not for myself but for my biological function. Patricia's treatment of me shifted noticeably, becoming warmer and more solicitous while also more controlling and directive. She had opinions about every aspect of my pregnancy, from which obstetrician I should see to what foods I should eat to how much rest I required. Her involvement was framed as motherly concern, but it felt more like management of a valuable asset that required careful handling to ensure optimal outcome. Vanessa, who had struggled with fertility issues before successfully having her own children, treated my pregnancy as an opportunity to position herself as an expert guide. She provided unsolicited advice about everything from morning sickness remedies to nursery design, speaking with the authority of someone who had navigated this terrain before and knew the correct path through it. Her guidance was relentless and exhausting, leaving me little space to develop my own approach to pregnancy and impending motherhood. Even Georgina, who had no children of her own, felt entitled to share opinions about my changing body, my emotional state, and my preparation for motherhood. She would make comments about how I was carrying the baby, predict the gender based on old wives' tales, and suggest activities that would supposedly benefit the child's development. The constant attention and commentary from all the Hartwell women created a sense that my pregnancy was a family project rather than a personal experience, something they were all invested in managing, rather than something I was living through as an individual. Michael was thrilled about the pregnancy in ways that felt genuine and touching. He attended every doctor's appointment, read books about fetal development and newborn care, and spoke with tender excitement about becoming a father. His enthusiasm was uncomplicated by the family dynamics that colored everything else in our life together, representing a space where we could simply be two people excited about becoming parents, rather than performing our roles as Hartwell family members. But even Michael's joy carried assumptions that revealed how he saw my future role. He spoke about how I would naturally want to focus more on motherhood, and less on other commitments once the baby arrived. He assumed I would be grateful for his mother's help and guidance, viewing Patricia's intrusion into every aspect of my pregnancy as generous support rather than controlling interference. He seemed to expect that becoming a mother would complete my transformation into a full Hartwell wife, finally resolving any lingering attachments to my previous identity as an independent businesswoman. I did not correct these assumptions directly because I was not yet certain myself how I would balance motherhood with my other responsibilities and commitments. I knew I wanted to be actively involved in raising my child, to be present for important moments and everyday routines. But I also knew I could not abandon the business empire I was building, could not simply walk away from responsibilities to employees and partners who depended on my leadership. I would need to find some way to integrate motherhood into my life rather than allowing it to replace everything else I was and everything else I did. My father understood this tension in ways Michael and his family never could. During one of his visits while I was pregnant, we sat in my study discussing succession planning for his companies. He was approaching 70 and wanted to ensure clear lines of authority were established before age or health issues created uncertainty. As we reviewed organizational charts and leadership structures, he paused and looked at me with the serious expression that indicated important words were coming. "Elena, you are about to become a mother, and that is a profound and beautiful thing," he began, speaking in the Italian we used for our most personal conversations. "But do not let anyone convince you that motherhood requires you to become smaller, to abandon your ambitions, to pretend that your competence and your power do not exist. Your child will benefit more from having a mother who is fully herself than from having a mother who has diminished herself to meet other people's expectations about what mothers should be." His words gave me permission to imagine a different path than the one the Hartwells were assuming I would follow. I could be a devoted mother and a successful business leader. I could raise my child while also building companies and making investments. I could integrate these identities rather than choosing between them, refusing the false dichotomy that suggested women must sacrifice professional achievement to be good mothers or sacrifice motherhood to be successful professionals. But claiming this integrated identity would require confronting the Hartwell family's expectations more directly than I had been willing to do thus far. It would mean establishing boundaries around my time and my priorities that they would certainly resist. It would mean insisting that my work was not a hobby I could set aside when it became inconvenient, but rather a serious professional commitment that deserved the same respect as Michael's career or Christopher's business activities. It would mean being willing to accept their disapproval and disappointment when I chose differently than they expected. I was not yet ready for that confrontation when Marco was born. The experience of childbirth itself was transformative in ways I had not anticipated, creating a vulnerability and openness that temporarily overwhelmed my usual careful control. I held my son in the hospital room and felt emotions that had no relationship to strategy or performance, just pure love and fierce protectiveness and wonder at this small person who had not existed in the world until moments before. Michael was tender and attentive during those early days, and I felt the marriage I had hoped for emerging from beneath the layers of family obligation and social performance. We were simply two people learning to care for a tiny human, figuring things out together, making mistakes and laughing about them, experiencing the profound intimacy that comes from shared responsibility for something so important and so fragile. Those moments reminded me why I had married him, what I had seen in him during our courtship that had made me believe we could build a genuine partnership. But the Hartwell family's involvement quickly reasserted itself, transforming the intimate early days of parenthood into a managed family production. Patricia arrived at the hospital with elaborate flower arrangements and detailed plans for Marco's homecoming. She had already hired a night nurse, arranged for a baby nurse to stay with us for the first month, and scheduled newborn photographs with a photographer she had used for all her grandchildren. These arrangements were presented as gifts, generous support from a grandmother who wanted to help, but they were actually mechanisms of control, ways of ensuring that Marco's early life unfolded according to Hartwell family traditions rather than according to Michael's and my preferences. I was too exhausted and overwhelmed to resist effectively in those early weeks. The night nurse Patricia had hired was competent but intrusive, taking over Marco's nighttime care in ways that prevented me from establishing my own rhythms and routines with my son. The baby nurse offered constant advice about feeding schedules and sleep training, presenting her recommendations as established best practices, rather than as one approach among many possibilities. The photographer captured beautiful images that Patricia immediately distributed to the family's social network, announcing Marco's arrival to people I had never met with captions that emphasized his position as the newest Hartwell heir. Through all of this, I watched and documented and began to understand that my son's life would be shaped by forces beyond my control, unless I was willing to assert boundaries more firmly than I had managed to do for myself. The Hartwells had plans for Marco that extended from his nursery design to his eventual career path, and those plans assumed I would be a facilitating presence rather than a determining authority. They spoke about his future as if it were already decided, as if his identity as a Hartwell boy inevitably led to predictable milestones and predetermined outcomes. I began to glimpse the pattern that would define the next several years of my life. I would continue performing the role of compliant Hartwell daughter-in-law, while simultaneously building my business empire in spaces they never examined. I would appear to accept their guidance while quietly making my own decisions about matters that actually affected my life and my son's development. I would maintain the fiction of grateful inclusion while documenting every instance of dismissal and control, gathering evidence of dynamics I might eventually need to prove to people who had not witnessed them directly. This strategy of dual identity required extraordinary discipline and emotional compartmentalization. I had to be constantly vigilant about which version of myself I was presenting in which context, careful never to let the mask slip in ways that would reveal the full extent of my separate existence. The effort was sustainable only because I had convinced myself it was temporary, that eventually circumstances would shift in ways that would allow me to integrate these fragmented parts of myself into a more coherent whole. But with each passing month, integration seemed less likely and fragmentation seemed more permanent. The Hartwell family had certain expectations about who I was and what I should want, and those expectations became more rigid rather than more flexible as time passed. My business success remained invisible to them, generating wealth and influence they never imagined, while they continued to treat me as someone who should be grateful for the opportunities their family name provided. The disconnect between their perception and reality grew wider, creating a chasm that would eventually become impossible to bridge. I told myself I was being strategic, that accepting short-term discomfort was the price of long-term stability for my marriage and my family. I convinced myself that protecting Michael from the full truth about his family's treatment of me was an act of love rather than an act of self-betrayal. I believed that maintaining peace was worth the cost of suppressing my authentic self, in contexts where that self was not welcome or valued. These rationalizations allowed me to continue functioning in an increasingly untenable situation, without acknowledging its unsustainability. The identity I had formed as Elena Hartwell was sophisticated and convincing, a masterwork of performance that fooled even people who should have known better. But it was fundamentally unstable, built on suppression rather than integration, maintained through constant effort rather than natural expression. I was playing a role that required me to be smaller than I was, quieter than I wanted to be, less ambitious than my actual goals demanded. And while I told myself this performance was temporary and strategic, I was actually constructing a prison whose bars were made of other people's expectations and my own desperate desire to make an impossible situation work. The woman I had become in the Hartwell household was not false exactly, but she was incomplete, a carefully curated version of myself that highlighted acceptable qualities while hiding everything that might challenge their comfortable assumptions. I had learned to excel at being what they wanted me to be while maintaining a separate existence where I could be who I actually was. This division served important purposes, protecting my business activities and preserving some core sense of self that remained untouched by their demands for conformity. But the psychological cost of this constant performance was accumulating in ways I did not fully recognize until much later. I was losing the ability to access my authentic responses even in private moments, so accustomed to performing that I no longer knew clearly what I actually felt or wanted beneath the layers of strategic presentation. I was becoming disconnected from my own experience, observing my life from a slight distance rather than fully inhabiting it, always aware of how things appeared rather than how they actually were. The only space where I felt fully real was in my study conducting business, the one context where I could exercise my actual judgment and speak with my genuine authority. Those hours represented the core of who I was, the identity that existed independent of anyone else's expectations or approval. I protected that space fiercely, guarding the time I spent there and the privacy of the work I conducted there, understanding instinctively that it was the foundation of whatever strength I still possessed. My father visited regularly during Marco's first year, and he could see what I was not yet ready to admit about the unsustainability of my situation. He would look at me with concern during our conversations in the study, noting the careful performance I maintained even when we were alone, observing how I had learned to moderate every response and calculate every statement. He worried about the cost of the life I was living but respected my autonomy enough not to tell me directly that I should leave. Instead, he simply reminded me regularly that I had options, that I was never trapped regardless of how trapped I might feel. "You have built something remarkable, Elena," he told me during one visit when Marco was 6 months old. "You have companies that are thriving, investments that are generating extraordinary returns, and capabilities that most people spend lifetimes developing. You have wealth and independence that exist completely separate from this family and this marriage. Never forget that you can walk away from anything that becomes intolerable. Your life does not require anyone's permission to change." I nodded and assured him I knew this, that I was managing fine, that the challenges I faced were normal adjustment issues that every young mother navigated. But even as I spoke these reassurances, I felt their inadequacy. I was not managing fine. I was coping through dissociation and compartmentalization, maintaining multiple incompatible identities through sheer force of will and constant performance. The system was working only because I was absorbing all its contradictions and costs personally, taking the stress into my own body and psyche rather than allowing it to disrupt the family's comfortable equilibrium. The identity I had formed as a Hartwell wife was a triumph of adaptation and a tragedy of self-abandonment, a demonstration of extraordinary capability deployed in service of diminishing myself to fit other people's limited vision of who I should be. I had become exactly what they wanted me to become while maintaining just enough separate existence to remember who I actually was. But that separation was becoming harder to sustain, and the effort required to maintain it was accumulating costs that would eventually demand payment in ways I could not yet imagine. The pattern that had established itself during the first year of my marriage did not remain static. It intensified systematically, each accommodation I made creating precedent for further accommodations, each boundary I failed to defend inviting additional encroachment, each moment I prioritized harmony over authenticity reinforcing the Hartwell family's conviction that their vision of how I should live was not only correct but welcomed. The imbalance that had been subtle initially became increasingly pronounced, widening into a chasm between what I contributed and what I received, between who I actually was and who they insisted I should be. The escalation accelerated after Marco's first birthday, when the initial period of acceptable maternal preoccupation was deemed to have concluded, and I was expected to resume full participation in family obligations and social commitments. Patricia announced this transition during a family dinner, speaking with the pleasant authority she wielded so effectively. Now that Marco is past the infant stage and you have excellent help managing his care, I am certain you will want to reclaim your place in our family activities and the charitable work that represents us in the community. I have taken the liberty of adding you to several committee rosters where your involvement would be most valuable. The statement was delivered as if conferring an honor, but it was actually a series of non-negotiable demands disguised as opportunities. I was being assigned to organizations I had not chosen, committed to schedules I had not approved, and volunteered for responsibilities I had not agreed to assume. My supposed desire to reclaim my place was entirely Patricia's invention, projected onto me as if my own preferences were irrelevant to decisions about how I would spend my time and energy. Michael nodded approvingly when his mother made this announcement, apparently seeing it as evidence of my successful integration into the family rather than as the controlling overreach it actually represented. He reached for my hand under the table and squeezed it warmly, his gesture communicating pride and pleasure that I was being included in important family activities. He could not see what I saw because he had never experienced having his autonomy systematically dismantled through 1,000 small assertions of someone else's authority over his choices and commitments. I smiled and thanked Patricia for thinking of me, playing the role of grateful daughter-in-law while internally calculating how much of my actual time these commitments would consume, and how I would maintain my business responsibilities while meeting these new social obligations. The committee meetings alone would require at least 15 hours per week, not counting the events those committees planned and the fundraising activities they coordinated. Add in the other expectations that came with being a visible Hartwell family member, the luncheons and galas and gallery openings and charity auctions, and I was looking at nearly a full-time job's worth of obligations that generated no income and served no purpose beyond maintaining the family's social positioning. My actual full-time job, managing the Castellano business empire and my own growing investment portfolio, would have to be compressed into whatever hours remained after family obligations were satisfied. I began waking at 5 in the morning to handle East Coast business before Marco woke, conducting calls from my study while the household still slept. I worked during Marco's nap times and after his bedtime, often staying up past midnight to review documents and make decisions that could not wait for more convenient moments. I traveled for essential meetings by framing them as personal errands or family visits, never acknowledging the professional purposes that actually motivated these trips. The physical toll of this schedule became apparent within months. I was perpetually exhausted, surviving on fragmented sleep and excessive caffeine, my body staging small rebellions through persistent headaches and digestive problems I tried to ignore. I lost weight I could not afford to lose, my clothes hanging looser as stress and insufficient sleep burned through my reserves. I noticed dark circles under my eyes that concealer could no longer fully hide, a persistent tension in my shoulders that massage could temporarily relieve but never fully resolve. The psychological cost was equally significant though less visible. I was experiencing a constant low-grade anxiety that never entirely dissipated, a background hum of stress that colored every interaction and every moment. I found myself snapping at Marco's nanny over minor issues, then feeling terrible guilt about my disproportionate reactions. I was short-tempered with Michael in ways that created distance between us, unable to explain that my irritability stemmed from exhaustion and resentment about expectations I was meeting at tremendous personal cost. The escalating imbalance manifested most clearly in how my time was valued compared to how other family members' time was treated. Christopher's work schedule was sacred, never to be interrupted or impinged upon by family obligations. When he missed family dinners or declined to attend social events, his absence was explained as necessary business commitments that everyone understood and accepted. Richard's time was similarly protected, his professional obligations automatically taking precedence over family activities without question or criticism. Michael's schedule was somewhat more flexible, but he still maintained clear boundaries between his work responsibilities and his family availability. When he needed to travel for business or work late on important deals, these commitments were respected without complaint. No one suggested he should delegate these responsibilities to others or questioned whether his work was truly important enough to justify his absence from family events. But my time was treated as infinitely flexible and perpetually available for whatever the family needed or wanted. When Patricia scheduled a charity luncheon during hours I had blocked for a crucial business meeting, she simply expected me to adjust my plans to accommodate her event. When Vanessa needed help organizing a fundraiser, She assumed I would make myself available for planning sessions that consumed entire afternoons. When Georgina wanted company for shopping or museum visits, she would call or stop by my study expecting immediate availability, seemingly oblivious to the possibility that I might be occupied with work that mattered. The fundamental assumption underlying all these expectations was that my activities were less important than theirs, that my time was less valuable, that my commitments were more easily rearranged because they were not real work deserving of protection and respect. They saw me reviewing documents and assumed I was managing household accounts. They knew I made phone calls but imagined I was chatting with friends or handling personal matters. They observed me traveling occasionally but thought I was visiting family, or taking personal trips rather than conducting business that generated more revenue than the entire Hartwell family firm produced in a year. This invisibility of my professional identity was partly my own doing, the result of my father's advice to maintain privacy about my business activities and my own strategic choice to let the Hartwells underestimate me. But it was also a reflection of their determined blindness to anything that contradicted their preferred narrative about who I was and what my role should be. They did not want to see me as a successful businesswoman because that identity complicated the simple story of the fortunate girl who had married into their family and should be grateful for the opportunities that marriage provided. The escalation extended beyond time and energy to encompass expectations about my appearance, my social performance, and my personal choices. Vanessa began making increasingly pointed comments about my wardrobe, suggesting that as Marco got older I should invest more in maintaining my appearance and representing the family well at public events. She recommended personal trainers who could help me get back to my pre-pregnancy body, aesthetic treatments that would refresh my tired-looking skin, and shopping expeditions where she could help me select more appropriate clothing for someone in my position. Patricia joined these improvement efforts with suggestions about my hair, my jewelry, and the overall impression I made at social events. She framed her feedback as loving concern, but the underlying message was clear. I was not quite polished enough, not quite refined enough, still not entirely meeting Hartwell standards despite years of effort. The implicit comparison was always to Vanessa, who devoted enormous time and resources to maintaining her appearance and who was held up as the model I should aspire to emulate. Even Georgina, who had initially seemed like a potential ally, participated in these campaigns to reshape me into their vision of an ideal Hartwell wife. She would casually mention beauty routines she thought I might benefit from, share articles about fashion trends I should incorporate into my wardrobe, and suggest social coaching that could help me feel more confident in elite circles. Her suggestions were delivered with friendly warmth, but they carried the same message as her mother's and sister-in-law's more pointed criticisms. I was a project requiring improvement, a work in progress that had not yet achieved acceptable completion. The cumulative effect of this constant evaluation and correction was corrosive to whatever remained of my self-esteem within the family context. I began to internalize their assessments, to see myself through their critical eyes, to notice every way I fell short of their exacting standards. I became hyper-aware of my appearance at family events, monitoring my posture and my expressions and my conversational contributions with exhausting vigilance. I second-guessed my clothing choices and my social decisions, always wondering if I had made errors they would later discuss and critique. This self-consciousness was entirely absent from my professional life, where I moved with confidence and authority that came from genuine competence and proven success. When I walked into business meetings, I commanded respect through my knowledge and my track record. When I made presentations to boards or negotiated with partners, I spoke with clarity and conviction that reflected my actual capabilities. When I made investment decisions or provided strategic direction, I trusted my judgment because I had years of evidence that my judgment was sound. But the moment I crossed from my study into the family areas of the mansion, I felt my confidence evaporate, replaced by the careful uncertainty of someone who knows she is being evaluated against standards she can never quite meet. I became smaller in those spaces, quieter and more deferential, always aware that my position in the family was contingent and provisional rather than secure and valued. The contrast between these two versions of myself was stark and painful, a constant reminder that I was living a divided existence that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The escalating imbalance also affected my relationship with Marco in ways that were subtle but significant. The Hartwells had strong opinions about how my son should be raised, what activities he should participate in, what values he should be taught, and what future he should be prepared to assume. They discussed his development and his education as if these were family decisions rather than parental ones, involving themselves in choices that should have belonged to Michael and me alone. Patricia was particularly invested in shaping Marco's early childhood, according to Hartwell traditions and expectations. She had hired the nanny without consulting me about my preferences or priorities. She had enrolled him in a prestigious preschool program, without asking whether I agreed with their educational philosophy. She had begun planning his eventual attendance at the boarding school where Michael and Christopher had been educated, speaking about this future as if it were already settled rather than subject to discussion and decision by his actual parents. When I tried to raise concerns about these unilateral decisions, Patricia would respond with patient explanations about family traditions and what had worked well for generations of Hartwell children. She would acknowledge my input with gracious phrases that nonetheless made clear she considered her experience and judgment superior to mine. She would remind me that she had successfully raised 3 children who had turned out well, implying that my inexperience as a first-time mother meant I should defer to her proven wisdom about child-rearing. Michael supported his mother's involvement more often than he supported my resistance to it. He had been raised according to these same traditions and methods, and he had turned out fine by conventional measures. He saw no reason to deviate from approaches that had worked for his family for generations. No value in my different perspective or my desire to make our own choices about our son's upbringing. When I pushed back against his mother's overreach, he would tell me I was being unnecessarily difficult about matters that were not important enough to justify family conflict. But the matters were important to me, desperately important, because they represented the last sphere where I might exercise genuine authority over my own life and my child's development. If I could not even protect my parenting choices from Patricia's colonization, then what autonomy did I actually possess? If my preferences about my own son's education and activities were subordinated to Hartwell family traditions, then in what sense was I actually his mother rather than simply the vessel who had delivered another Hartwell heir to be shaped according to their specifications? The realization that I was losing control over even this most fundamental relationship was devastating in ways I struggled to articulate. I would watch Marco playing with toys his grandmother had selected, wearing clothes she had purchased, following routines she had established, and feel a desperate sadness that this child who was supposed to be mine was actually being raised according to someone else's vision and values. I loved him fiercely and completely, but my love was being channeled through structures and expectations I had not chosen and increasingly could not influence. The escalating imbalance created distance in my marriage as well, a growing gulf between Michael and me that neither of us fully acknowledged or addressed. He seemed content with how our life together was unfolding, pleased that I had integrated into his family and grateful that his mother was so involved in helping us raise Marco. He interpreted my exhaustion as normal working mother tiredness, my irritability as hormonal fluctuation or stress that would pass, my increasing emotional withdrawal as a phase rather than a symptom of fundamental problems in how our relationship and our household functioned. I tried to talk to him about what I was experiencing, to explain how his family's constant involvement felt more like control than support, how their expectations were consuming my time and energy in ways that left nothing for my own priorities and preferences. But these conversations went nowhere because we were speaking different languages. Michael heard my concerns as complaints about minor inconveniences that could be managed through better communication or small adjustments. He could not hear them as descriptions of systematic undermining of my autonomy, because he had never experienced his own autonomy being systematically undermined. When I mentioned feeling overwhelmed by social obligations, he suggested I should decline less important events, not understanding that his mother determined which events were important, and that declining anything Patricia deemed significant would create conflict I was expected to avoid. When I expressed frustration about parenting decisions being made without my input, he assured me his mother only wanted to help, and that I should appreciate her willingness to share her experience rather than being defensive about accepting guidance. When I tried to explain that I needed more time for my work, he seemed puzzled about why managing my father's businesses required so much attention when surely his associates could handle day-to-day operations without constant oversight. His inability to see what I was experiencing or to take my perspective seriously was perhaps the most painful aspect of the escalating imbalance. I had married him believing we would be partners, that we would build a life together based on mutual respect and shared decision-making. Instead, I found myself increasingly isolated within a marriage where my husband consistently sided with his family against me, where my needs were perpetually subordinated to family harmony, where my actual experience of our life together mattered less than maintaining the fiction that everything was fine. The isolation was compounded by the fact that I had no one I could talk to who would truly understand what I was experiencing. My father saw some of it, but he was dealing with his own health challenges and I did not want to burden him with problems I felt I should be capable of managing myself. The friends I had maintained from before my marriage had gradually drifted away, casualties of my limited availability and my inability to be fully honest about my life circumstances. The women in the Hartwell social circle were not potential confidants because they were invested in the same system that was oppressing me, beneficiaries of the same hierarchies that kept me in my subordinate position. I was profoundly alone despite being constantly surrounded by people, unable to be authentic with anyone because authenticity would require acknowledging that my life was not working, that my marriage was not the partnership I had believed I was entering, that my integration into the Hartwell family had been achieved through systematic erasure of my actual identity and preferences. Admitting these realities felt dangerous because I could not see any path forward that did not involve either accepting permanent diminishment or destroying the life I had built through enormous effort and sacrifice. So I continued managing the escalating imbalance through the same strategies I had developed during the earlier years of my marriage. I compressed my business activities into smaller windows of time, sacrificing sleep and personal care to meet professional obligations while also meeting family expectations. I attended the social events and served on the committees Patricia assigned me to, performing my role as a Hartwell wife with the same skill I brought to complex business negotiations. I accepted corrections and suggestions about my appearance and my behavior, making enough adjustments to reduce criticism while maintaining enough autonomy to preserve some sense of self. But the cost of this continued accommodation was accumulating in ways I could not indefinitely sustain. My body was showing signs of chronic stress that no amount of yoga or meditation could fully address. My mental health was deteriorating, manifesting in anxiety that sometimes spiked into full panic attacks I had to hide from everyone around me. My relationship with Michael was becoming increasingly hollow, reduced to cordial coexistence rather than genuine intimacy. My connection to my own experience was fraying, creating a dissociation where I often felt like I was watching my life from outside rather than actually living it. The escalating imbalance had reached a point where small adjustments and better time management could not resolve the fundamental problems. The system was not sustainable, but I was not yet ready to acknowledge its unsustainability because doing so would require making choices I was not prepared to make. I told myself I just needed to get through this current period, that circumstances would eventually improve, that once Marco was older or Michael's career was more established or Patricia was less involved, the pressure would ease and I would be able to reclaim more of my life for myself. These were comforting lies that allowed me to continue functioning in an impossible situation. The truth, which I was not yet willing to face, was that the imbalance would continue escalating until something broke, that accommodation would never lead to acceptance, that performing the role of grateful Hartwell daughter-in-law would never earn me the respect and autonomy I deserved. The system was designed to extract maximum compliance while providing minimum recognition, to take everything I was willing to give and then demand more, to consume my energy and my identity in service of maintaining hierarchies that benefited everyone except me. The breaking point was approaching, though I could not yet see it clearly. I was operating at the absolute limit of my capacity, juggling impossible demands through increasingly desperate measures, holding together a life that was fundamentally unsustainable through sheer force of will and refusal to admit defeat. Something would have to give, some element of this precarious balance would have to fail, some crisis would have to emerge that made continuation of the status quo impossible. I did not know when that moment would arrive or what form it would take. I only knew with growing certainty that it was coming, that the escalating imbalance was building toward an inevitable reckoning, that the careful performance I had maintained for years was approaching its final act. The question was not whether the system would collapse but when, and whether I would be prepared to choose myself when that moment finally arrived or whether I would find some way to continue sacrificing myself for a family that would never value that sacrifice as anything more than their expected due. My father's health deteriorated with the cruel arithmetic of terminal illness, each month subtracting capabilities he had possessed the month before, each week introducing new limitations he had never previously confronted. The cancer that had started in his pancreas metastasized to his liver, and then to his lungs, spreading through his body with the same methodical efficiency. he had once brought to building his business empire. He faced this progression with remarkable equanimity, treating his own mortality as he had treated difficult negotiations. With clear-eyed assessment of realities, he could not change and strategic focus on variables he could still control. Alessandro Castellano had been more than my father. He had been my mentor, my advocate, my refuge from a world that increasingly demanded I become someone I was not. Our relationship transcended typical parent-child dynamics because he had raised me to be his successor, training me with the same rigor he would have applied to any protege regardless of biological connection. He taught me to read financial statements with the skepticism of an auditor and the vision of an entrepreneur. He showed me how to evaluate people through their actions rather than their words, how to recognize integrity and competence beneath surface presentations. He modeled a way of moving through the world with quiet confidence that required no external validation, because it was rooted in genuine capability and proven results. More importantly, my father had been the only person in my adult life who saw me clearly and completely, who understood both the businesswoman managing a diverse portfolio and the woman struggling to maintain her identity within a family system designed to erase it. He alone knew the full scope of what I owned and what I accomplished. He alone witnessed both versions of my existence without requiring me to perform or pretend. In his presence, I could drop the careful performance I maintained everywhere else and simply be Elena Castellano, his daughter and his partner in building something that would outlast both of us. When doctors confirmed that his cancer had progressed beyond any possibility of cure, my father approached the remaining months of his life with characteristic pragmatism. He accelerated the transition of authority to me, introducing me to partners and associates who would need to trust my leadership after his death. He reviewed every aspect of our business holdings with meticulous detail, ensuring I understood not just the current state of each venture, but the strategic vision that had guided their development and the principles that should inform future decisions. He updated his will and established clear succession structures that would prevent any ambiguity about my authority once he was gone. These preparations were conducted with efficiency rather than sentimentality. Business transactions that happened to involve a dying man, ensuring his life's work would continue successfully under new leadership. But beneath the professional surface, these meetings carried profound emotional weight. We were both aware that each review of a property portfolio or discussion of an investment strategy might be our last conversation about that aspect of the business. We were transferring not just legal authority but accumulated wisdom, not just assets but legacy, not just companies but a vision of what those companies could become under guidance that honored their origins while embracing new possibilities. The Hartwell family expressed appropriate sympathy when they learned of my father's terminal diagnosis, but their concern remained abstract and performative. They had met Alessandro Castellano multiple times during my marriage, but they had never invested effort in actually knowing him. To them, he was simply my father, a moderately successful businessman from a background they did not fully understand, someone who loved his daughter but whose significance to their lives was minimal. They could not comprehend that this man they had dismissed with polite indifference was actually one of the most successful entrepreneurs of his generation, that his business acumen exceeded anything the Hartwell family had produced in 4 generations, that his wealth dwarfed their inherited fortune in ways they had never imagined. Patricia offered assistance with whatever I might need during this difficult time, vague gestures of support that required no actual effort or sacrifice on her part. Richard expressed condolences in the formal language he might have used with any business associate facing family illness. Christopher and Vanessa sent flowers to my father's hospital room with a card bearing their names but no personal message. Georgina was perhaps the most genuine in her sympathy, calling to check on me and offering to accompany me to doctor's appointments if I needed company, though even her kindness was limited by her inability to understand what my father actually meant to me. Michael tried to be supportive within the constraints of his own limited emotional capacity and demanding work schedule. He accompanied me to some hospital visits, though he usually spent these visits working on his laptop in the waiting room rather than sitting with my father and me. He asked periodically how I was holding up, accepting my assurances that I was managing fine without probing beneath the surface to discover whether those assurances were actually true. He seemed to expect that I would grieve my father's approaching death in ways that were contained and manageable, that would not disrupt our household routines or interfere with family obligations and social commitments. What Michael and his family could not see was that my father's illness represented far more than the impending loss of a beloved parent. It represented the removal of the only buffer that had made my life in the Hartwell household even marginally bearable. My father had been my connection to a world where I was valued for my competence rather than my compliance, where my judgment was trusted rather than questioned, where my contributions were recognized rather than dismissed. He had been the anchor that kept me grounded in my actual identity, even as I performed a different identity for the Hartwells. He had been the reminder that I was capable and accomplished and deserving of respect, evidence that contradicted the messages I received daily from my husband's family about my inadequacy and my need for their guidance and correction. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.